Observer Lien had been recording galactic summits for over 400 cycles. She had watched empires argue, alliances break, and civilizations rise and fall across the stars. Very little surprised her anymore. But on the first day of the Galactic Concord Summit, aboard the neutral station Horizon Accord, she noticed something small that she could not ignore. The human delegation arrived with only 5 members. Every other species brought dozens, some brought hundreds. The Rule Dominion alone had 47 representatives, all wearing their dark military armor and walking in heavy, loud steps. The Oshari Collective sent 30 of their tall, insect-like diplomats, their thin legs clicking softly against the station floor. Even the smallest species, those with barely a voice in galactic politics, brought at least 15. Humanity sent 5. Lien watched them enter the Grand Chamber. At the front walked Kim Taeho, the lead human ambassador. He was not a tall man. He did not wear anything impressive. Just a simple dark suit, clean and sharp. His face showed nothing. No smile, no worry, no anger. He looked the way a man looks when he already knows how the day will end. Behind him walked Yoon Hana, the vice ambassador and chief negotiator. She was small, even by human standards, with her dark hair pulled back neatly. She carried a single data tablet and nothing else. Next came Lee Nari, the intelligence director, a woman with calm eyes that moved across the room like she was reading every face at once. Then Park Do-han, the military commander, who was not even supposed to be at a diplomatic event, but was listed as a security advisor. And finally, Choi Sun-woo, the cultural attaché, who gave a polite nod to the watching media drones as he passed. 5 people, 5 chairs, that was all. Lien made a small note in her chronicle and moved on. The Grand Chamber was enormous. It had been built to hold representatives from over 300 species, and today it was full. Curved rows of seats rose in every direction around a central platform where the speakers would stand. Lights floated above, like small stars, adjusting their color and brightness to match the visual needs of every species present. The air was carefully controlled, a mix of gases that kept everyone alive and comfortable, though not everyone could agree on what comfortable meant. Grand Arbiter Velon opened the summit. He was Mithari, one of the oldest species in the Concord. His body was tall and thin, covered in a gray skin that looked like old stone. His voice was deep and slow, and when he spoke, the chamber always fell silent. Not out of respect, Lien sometimes thought, but out of habit. Velon had been the Grand Arbiter for so long that most species could not imagine anyone else in the role. He welcomed the delegations. He spoke of unity and shared purpose. And then he introduced the main agenda of the summit, the topic that had brought everyone here: the redistribution of hyperspace corridor access. Hyperspace corridors were the roads of the galaxy. Without them, traveling between star systems took years. With them, it took days. But corridors were not natural. They had to be found, mapped, and stabilized with complex technology. And right now, 3 of the most critical junction corridors in the galaxy were held by humanity. Humans had discovered them. Humans had built the stabilization arrays. Humans maintained them, and humanity allowed every species to use them freely. That, apparently, was no longer enough. Warlord Gatan of the Rule Dominion was the first to speak after Velon. He was a massive creature, broad and armored, with a voice like grinding metal. He stood at the central platform and looked around the chamber with cold, yellow eyes. The Terran-held corridors are too important to remain under the control of a single species, he said. These corridors serve hundreds of worlds. They are the lifeline of galactic trade. It is not fair, and it is not safe for one young species to hold this much power over all of us. I move that these corridors be placed under Concord jurisdiction, managed collectively for the good of all. The chamber murmured. Many heads nodded. From the upper rows, several delegations signaled their support openly. Gatton smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. Lien looked at the Oshari delegation. The Oshari Collective had a trade partnership with Earth. They used human corridors more than almost anyone. She expected Delegate Pren, their representative, to speak against the motion, but Pren sat perfectly still. His large compound eyes stared forward. He did not oppose it. It was a betrayal, quiet and clean, and Lien recorded it without comment. Yoon Hana raised her hand and was given the floor. She stood at the platform and looked up at the hundreds of faces staring down at her. She did not look nervous. She did not look angry. She looked like a teacher about to ask a very simple question. I would like to ask the Grand Arbiter one thing, she said. Her voice was soft but clear. Under what legal precedent can the Concord seize infrastructure that was discovered, built, and maintained entirely by a single species, using that species' own resources and technology? The chamber went quiet. Velon shifted in his seat. His gray fingers tapped the armrest once. The Concord operates on collective consensus, Velon said slowly, not on precedent. Hana stared at him for a moment. Then she nodded politely and returned to her seat. She did not argue. She did not push. She simply let the answer hang in the air for everyone to hear. The Concord did not need a legal reason. They just needed enough votes. And that was exactly what she wanted the room to understand. Kim Tae-ho had not spoken a single word during the entire session. He sat in his chair with his hands folded, watching everything. At one point, Lee Nari leaned over and passed him a data tablet. He looked at it for a few seconds, then set it down. His expression did not change. When the session ended, the delegations filed out, talking loudly among themselves. The mood was confident. Most believed the vote would pass easily. Humanity was outnumbered, outweighed, and had only 12 cycles of membership. What could 5 people do against the will of the galaxy? Lien stayed behind to finish her notes. She looked at the 5 empty human chairs and wrote her final observation for the day. The humans did not argue. They did not protest. They simply watched. In my 400 cycles of observation, silence from a delegation has never meant compliance. I do not know what it means this time, but I find that I am paying attention. She closed her chronicle and left the chamber. And for the first time in a very long while, she felt the cold weight of something she could not name. The second day of the summit began before the sun cycle lights of Horizon Accord had fully brightened. While most delegations rested in their quarters or gathered in the common halls to talk, the real work was happening behind closed doors. Yoon Hana walked through a narrow corridor on the station's lower level. It was quieter here, away from the cameras and the crowds. She reached a small meeting room and stepped inside. Delegate Pren of the Oshari Collective was already waiting. He stood when she entered. His insect-like body was tall and thin, with 4 long arms folded tightly against his chest. His compound eyes reflected the room's soft light in dozens of tiny points. He looked nervous, though with the Oshari, it was hard to tell. Their faces did not move the way human faces did. Ambassador Yoon, Pren said. His voice buzzed slightly, a feature of Oshari's speech. I appreciate you meeting with me privately. She sat down across from him and placed a single data chip on the table between them. I brought you something. Pren looked at the chip. His antennae moved forward slightly, a sign of curiosity. He picked it up and connected it to his personal reader. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his antennae began to tremble. The file contained a projection. It showed in clear and simple numbers what would happen to Oshari trade revenue if human corridor access was revoked. The Oshari Collective moved 80% of their goods through human-maintained corridors. Without them, they would need to reroute through slower, longer paths controlled by other species who would charge heavy fees. The numbers showed a 40% drop in trade income within the first cycle, and a total economic collapse within 3. Pren stared at the numbers for a long time. Hana did not pressure him. She did not raise her voice or make threats. She simply waited. "We do not ask for loyalty," she said finally. Her voice was calm and kind, almost gentle. "We just want you to understand what you are choosing." She stood, gave a small bow of respect, and left the room. Pren remained at the table, his antennae still trembling, staring at numbers that spelled the end of everything his people had built. On the other side of the station, in a large private hall, Warlord Gatton of the Rural Dominion was holding court. He had gathered representatives from 11 species, all of them either allies of the rule or small enough to be pressured. The mood was loud and confident. Gatton stood at the center, his massive frame casting a shadow over the smaller delegates around him. He spoke with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. "The humans sent 5 delegates," he said, and several of the gathered species laughed. 5. Where others send 50. This is either arrogance or ignorance, and both are weakness. They sit in their chairs and say nothing. They ask polite questions and accept polite answers. This is not strength. This is a species that does not understand how power works. The room murmured in agreement. Gatton continued building his voting block, promising each species a piece of the human corridors once the vote passed. A section here, a junction there. Everyone would get something. Everyone would benefit. Everyone except humanity. 3 floors above, in a small secured room that Lee Nari had swept for listening devices twice, the human delegation sat together. Nari placed her tablet on the table and projected a series of intercepted communications into the air above it. The messages were between Gatton and 3 other species, sent weeks before the summit had even begun. They showed exactly what Hana and Teho had suspected. The vote was never about fairness or collective good. Gatton had been planning a resource grab from the start. He had promised different sections of human corridors to different allies, carving up humanity's work like meat on a table. "He started this before we even arrived," Nari said quietly. The vote was decided before the summit began. Choi Sun-woo, the cultural attaché, leaned back in his chair. "The galactic media is already running the story their way. The headline across most networks is, 'Concord moves to fairly redistribute resources.' We are being painted as the obstacle, the greedy newcomers who refuse to share." Teho listened to all of it without expression. He sat with his arms folded, his eyes focused on the projected messages floating in the air. When Sunwoo finished, the room fell silent, waiting for him. Teho turned to Hana. "The Oshari?" Pren saw the numbers, Hana said. "He understands what happens to his people. He will not vote against us, but I do not think he will vote for us either. He will abstain." "That is enough," Teho said. He stood and walked to the far wall, where a communication panel was built into the station's framework. He entered a secure channel code that only 2 people in the galaxy knew. The screen flickered, and the face of Commander Park Dohan appeared. Dohan was aboard the flagship of the human expeditionary fleet, stationed just outside the neutral zone. His face was hard and still, like a man carved from stone. Behind him, through the bridge windows, the distant light of stars reflected off the hulls of human warships. "Dohan," Teho said. "Status." "Fleet is rested," Dohan replied. His voice was flat and steady. "Corridors are mapped. Kill switches are live. Hold position. Do not blink." "Understood." The screen went dark. Teho stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the panel. Then he turned back to his team. "We go to the vote tomorrow," he said. "Everyone knows their role. There is nothing more to discuss." The team nodded and began to leave. Hana paused at the door and looked back at him. There was something in her eyes, not doubt, but the weight of what was coming. Taeho met her gaze and gave a single small nod. She returned it and left. Later that night, Taeho stood alone at one of the station's observation windows. The view was enormous, a wide curve of glass that looked out into open space. Stars stretched in every direction, cold and endless. Somewhere out there, billions of humans lived their lives, built their cities, raised their children, and had no idea what was about to happen in a room they had never seen. He heard soft footsteps behind him. He did not turn. Observer Lien stepped up beside him. Her species, the Tessic, were small and quiet, with smooth silver skin and wide dark eyes that recorded everything they saw. She carried no weapons, held no political power, and served no agenda. She simply watched and wrote. That was her purpose. That was all she had ever done. "Ambassador Kim," she said, "may I ask you for a statement, for the official record?" Taeho was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the stars. "Write that humanity came to the table in good faith," he said. His voice was calm, almost soft. "Make sure that part is very clear." Lien studied his face. There was no anger there, no sadness, just a stillness that felt heavier than anything she had ever recorded. She had interviewed warlords and emperors, tyrants and saints. She had heard threats and promises and lies beyond counting. But something about the way this man spoke made the air around him feel different. It was not what he said. It was everything he was choosing not to say. "I will make sure," she said quietly. Taeho nodded once and returned his gaze to the stars. Lien walked away, her silver fingers already moving over her chronicle device. She typed a single line before returning to her quarters. "I am uneasy tonight, and I do not fully understand why, but I believe tomorrow will be a day the galaxy remembers." She closed her device and tried to sleep. Sleep did not come. The grand chamber was full. Every seat was taken. Every species had sent their complete delegation, and the curved rows of the massive room were alive with color, sound, and movement. Hundreds of alien forms shifted and whispered, their translators humming softly as conversations crossed languages and species lines. The floating lights above adjusted and brightened. The media drones circled slowly, recording everything. Across the galactic network, billions of beings on thousands of worlds watched the live feed. Today was the vote. Today the Concord would decide the fate of the 3 human-held hyperspace corridors, the most important trade routes in the known galaxy. Observer Lien sat in her usual place, high in the back rows where she could see everything. Her silver fingers rested on her chronicle device, ready to record. She had not slept well. The feeling from the night before still sat heavy in her chest. A sense that something was about to change and could not be changed back. She looked down at the human delegation. All 5 of them sat in their seats, calm and still. Kim Taeho was at the center, his hands folded in his lap. Yoon Hana sat to his right, her data tablet on the armrest beside her. Lee Nari, Park Do-han, and Choi Sun-woo filled the remaining chairs. They looked the same as they had on the first day, unhurried, unworried, complete. Grand Arbiter Velon called the chamber to order. His deep voice echoed through the room, and the murmuring stopped. He reviewed the motion formally. The proposal was simple in its language. The 3 hyperspace corridors, currently maintained by the Terran delegation, would be transferred to Concord jurisdiction, managed collectively for the benefit of all member species. He then invited the sponsoring delegate to speak. Warlord Gatton rose from his seat and walked to the central platform. His heavy boots struck the floor with each step, and the sound carried through the silent chamber like a drumbeat. Gatton spoke for nearly 15 minutes. He talked about fairness. He talked about the danger of allowing a single species to control critical infrastructure. He talked about shared prosperity and the founding values of the Concord. He used words like unity and balance and collective future. His voice was strong and sure, and when he finished, several delegations clapped or signaled their approval in the ways of their species. Gatton smiled his sharp-toothed smile and returned to his seat. Velen turned to the human delegation. The floor is offered to the Terran representatives for their final response before the vote. The chamber leaned forward. Everyone expected a long and desperate speech. They expected arguments, legal challenges, emotional pleas. They expected humanity to fight for what was theirs with words, because words were all they had in this room. Kim Tae-ho stood. He adjusted his coat. He walked to the central platform slowly, his footsteps quiet on the polished floor. He looked out at the chamber, at the hundreds of faces looking down at him, and for a moment he said nothing at all. Then he spoke. "Thank you, Grand Arbiter. Thank you to every delegation present. Humanity has listened carefully throughout this summit. We have heard the concerns. We understand the motion, and we understand what this vote represents." He paused. The chamber was perfectly silent. "We want every delegation here to understand that we also know what it costs." Another pause, longer this time. "If this motion passes, the human delegation will formally withdraw from the Galactic Concord, effective immediately." For one full second, there was no sound at all. The silence was so complete that Lian could hear her own heartbeat. Then the chamber exploded. Voices erupted from every direction. Delegates shouted at each other, at the platform, at the human seats. Translators struggled to keep up with the overlapping languages. Several delegations rose to their feet. Others turned to their neighbors with wide eyes and open mouths. Yoon Hana stood from her seat. She walked to the platform and placed a data chip on the podium beside Tae-ho. She did not speak. She did not need to. The chip contained a formal withdrawal document, written in the legal language of the Concord, translated into every galactic language, signed by every member of the human delegation, and dated 3 days ago. 3 days ago, before the summit had even begun. This was not a reaction. This was not an emotional threat made in the heat of the moment. Humanity had walked into this summit, knowing exactly how it would end. They had come prepared to leave. The realization moved through the chamber like a wave. Lian watched it happen. She saw it in the way the shouting slowed, the way the anger turned to confusion, and the confusion turned to something colder. The delegates were not just surprised. They were shaken. Grand Arbiter Velen struck the podium with his staff, calling for order. It took nearly a full minute for the noise to die down. "This is unnecessary," Velen said, and his voice had lost some of its usual weight. "The vote is advisory. It is non-binding. There is no need for such extreme measures." Tae-ho looked at him calmly. "Grand Arbiter, you told my Vice Ambassador 2 days ago that the Concord operates on collective consensus, not precedent. If the consensus of this body is to take what is ours, then the consensus of our species is to leave. I believe that is how this works." Velon had no response. From his seat, Warlord Gatton let out a short, rough laugh. "Let them bluff," he said, loud enough for the entire chamber to hear. "Call the vote. They will not leave. They cannot afford to." Velon looked at Tae-ho. Tae-ho said nothing. He simply returned to his seat and sat down. The vote was called. Delegations registered their decisions one by one. The numbers appeared on the central display above the platform, counting upward in real time. In favor, against, abstaining. The chamber watched in tense silence as the results climbed. The motion passed. 67% in favor, 20% abstaining, including the Oshari Collective, 13% against. The number locked on the display, glowing green. The motion had carried. Gatton leaned back in his seat with a satisfied look. Several of his allies exchanged approving glances. Kim Tae-ho looked at the number for a long moment. Then he nodded, just once, a small, quiet motion of his head, as if confirming something he had already known. He looked to his left. Hana, Nari, Dohan, Sunwoo. They were already standing. All 5 members of the human delegation rose from their chairs at the same time. There was no signal that Lien could see. No word spoken. They simply moved together, the way people move when they have practiced something so many times that it no longer needs thought. Tae-ho straightened his coat. Hana picked up her data tablet. Nari collected the intelligence files. Dohan stood like a wall. Sunwoo gave one last look at the media drones, and his face showed nothing but calm. They walked toward the chamber doors. Not fast, not slow. The same steady, even pace that Tae-ho had used when he entered 3 days ago. They did not look back. They did not make a final statement. They did not slam anything or shout or curse. They simply left. The chamber watched them go. No one spoke. No one moved. Even Gatton's smile had faded into something uncertain. Observer Lien's fingers had stopped moving. She realized she had been writing a sentence and had stopped halfway through. Her silver hands hovered over the chronicle device, frozen. She stared at the 5 figures walking across the chamber floor toward the massive doors at the far end. She had watched empires fall. She had seen species vanish from the galactic stage. She had recorded wars and betrayals and acts of cruelty that still kept her awake at night. But she had never, in 400 cycles, felt what she felt now. She was afraid. The doors opened. The 5 humans passed through them. And then the doors closed, and the sound of it echoed through the grand chamber like the last beat of a heart. Nobody spoke for a very long time. Lien looked down at her chronicle device. The half-finished sentence stared back at her. She deleted it and wrote something new. Today, humanity left the galactic concord. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They stood up and they walked out. And the galaxy, for the first time in living memory, did not know what to do next. She saved the entry and closed her eyes. The chamber around her slowly began to fill with noise again, voices and arguments and panic. But Lien did not listen. She sat in her seat, high in the back rows, and let the fear settle into her bones. Something had ended today, and something far worse had begun. In the first hour after the human delegation walked out of the Grand Chamber, Grand Arbiter Velon told the remaining delegations that there was nothing to worry about. He stood at his podium with his hands clasped behind his back and spoke in his deep, steady voice. He called the walkout theatrical posturing. He said that humanity would return once emotions cooled. He reminded the chamber that no species had ever left the Concord permanently. There was nowhere else to go. In the second hour, the human delegation boarded their shuttle and departed Horizon Accord without a single word to anyone on the station. In the third hour, the corridors went dark. Commander Park Do-han received a single coded message from Kim Tae-ho. It is done. Do-han read the message once, deleted it, and turned to his bridge crew aboard the flagship of the human expeditionary fleet. Begin protocol homeward, he said. Across 3 different sectors of the galaxy, the human maintained stabilization arrays that held the hyperspace corridors open received a shutdown command. The arrays did not explode. They did not collapse. They simply powered down, one by one, like lights going out in a long hallway. Within minutes, the corridors began to destabilize. The invisible pathways through folded space that allowed ships to cross vast distances in days instead of years started to twist and blur. Warning signals fired automatically on every navigation system in every ship within range. Within 6 hours, the corridors were gone, not destroyed, just closed. The space where they had been was still there, but without the stabilization technology, it was wild and dangerous. A mess of shifting gravity and unpredictable energy that no ship could safely travel through. 40 species use those corridors every single day. Cargo ships, passenger vessels, medical transports, military convoys. All of them were suddenly cut off from their fastest, safest routes across the galaxy. The panic started slowly and then hit all at once. On Horizon Accord, the communication systems overloaded within hours. Emergency distress signals flooded in from stranded ships that had been mid-transit when the corridors collapsed. Trade convoys carrying food and fuel to dozens of worlds were stuck in deep space with no fast way home. Colony supply ships that ran on strict schedules had nowhere to go. Medical transports carrying critical supplies to border worlds sent desperate calls for help that echoed through Concord channels with no answer. Delegate Pren of the Oshari Collective was one of the first to act. He tried to contact Yoon Hana on every channel he could reach. His calls went unanswered. He tried the official human diplomatic frequency. Silence. He tried the back channels that the Oshari had used for years of quiet trade partnership with Earth. Nothing. Every line was dead. Pren stood in his quarters, his 4 hands gripping the edges of his communication console, and felt the numbers from Hada's projection burning in his mind. 40% drop. Economic collapse within 3 cycles. He had thought he had time. He had thought he could stay neutral and survive. He was wrong. Across the station, Warlord Gatton raged. He stormed into an emergency session of the Concord Council and demanded immediate action. His voice shook the walls of the smaller chamber where the council met. "This is an act of war," he roared. "The humans have attacked the infrastructure of the galaxy. They have held us hostage. The Concord must respond with force." Grand Arbiter Velon sat at the head of the table and listened. When Gatton finished, Velon asked a single question. The corridors were built by humans, maintained by humans, powered by human technology. They shut down their own equipment. What law have they broken? Gatton slammed his fist on the table. The law of survival. We need those corridors. Need is not ownership, Velon said quietly, and the room fell silent. The Grand Arbiter's own words from 2 days ago, the same logic he had used to justify taking the corridors from humanity, had just been turned back on him. Need is not ownership, consensus is not law, and the Concord had no legal ground to stand on. He demanded a military response. He wanted the Concord fleet to enter human space and force them to reactivate the corridors. Velon looked at him with ancient, tired eyes and said, "You want to invade the species that mapped and stabilized unstable hyperspace, and you want to reach them by traveling through the unstable hyperspace they just shut down. Tell me how." Gatton had no answer. He stood there, his massive body trembling with anger, and for the first time since the summit began, he had nothing to say. While the Concord argued, Choi Sun-woo released a single public statement to every galactic media network. It was short, it was clear, and it was devastating. Humanity built those corridors. Humanity maintained those corridors. Humanity asked for nothing in return except the right to keep what was ours. That right was voted away, so we took our work and left. We wish the Concord well. The statement spread across the galaxy within hours. It was translated into every known language. It appeared on news feeds and public displays on hundreds of worlds. And it did what no long speech or angry argument could have done. It made the galaxy understand exactly what had happened, in the simplest possible terms. Humanity had given freely. The galaxy had taken more. And now, humanity had stopped giving. In her quarters, observer Lian began reviewing the historical records of humanity's time in the Concord. She had always known that humans were productive members, but she had never looked at the details closely. Now, as she read through 12 cycles of records, a picture began to form that made her silver skin go cold. The corridor stabilization technology was human. The long-range communication relays that the Concord used for real-time transmissions across sectors were based on human designs, improved and upgraded by human engineers. The atmospheric purification systems used on over 60 Concord stations, including Horizon Accord itself, were built using patents that humanity had shared openly. Medical scanning technology, agricultural yield algorithms, water purification methods for colony worlds, energy distribution networks. Humanity had not just occupied a seat at the table. They had quietly become the table. In 12 short cycles, they had woven themselves into the foundation of galactic civilization so deeply that pulling them out would bring down walls that most species did not even know existed. Lian sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. She understood now. She understood the silence, the calm, the 5-person delegation. Humanity had not come to the summit to fight. They had come already knowing they had won. The vote did not matter. The speeches did not matter. What mattered was that humanity had built things the galaxy could not live without, and they had done it so quietly that no one had noticed until it was too late. Back in the Concord Council chamber, the cracks were already forming. Species that had voted in favor of the motion began to turn on each other. Accusations flew. Blame shifted. 3 delegations announced they were opening private channels to Earth. 2 more left the station entirely, heading home to deal with their own supply crises. The unity that Velen had spoken about on the first day was crumbling. At the end of the day, the grand chamber was empty. The lights had dimmed to their night cycle. The media drones had stopped circling. The great curved rows of seats were dark and silent. Grand Arbiter Velen sat alone in the center of the chamber. He looked at the 5 empty human chairs. They were the same as every other chair in the room, plain and simple, designed to be functional and nothing more. But now they felt like the most important seats in the galaxy. He had been the Grand Arbiter for longer than most species could remember. He had guided the Concord through wars and crises and disasters. He had always known what to do. He did not know what to do now. The lights above him flickered once, a small power fluctuation caused by the loss of one of the energy distribution nodes that ran on human-designed systems. Velon looked up at the flickering light, and for the first time in his long life, felt truly small. Outside the station, the stars burned on, cold and indifferent, and somewhere in the vast dark between them, the human fleet was already moving home. 2 galactic cycles passed, and the galaxy became a different place. 3 minor species on the outer edges of Concord space suffered famines. Their food supply ships had depended on human corridors, and the alternative routes were too long and too expensive. Emergency aid was slow because the Concord's own logistics network had been built around the corridors that no longer existed. Worlds that had never worried about hunger before were now rationing meals. The Rule Dominion, once the loudest voice in the Grand Chamber, was falling apart from the inside. Warlord Gaton's military supply lines had run through 2 of the 3 human corridors. Without them, his fleets were scattered across sectors they could not easily reach. Fuel shipments were delayed. Weapons factories on distant worlds sat idle, waiting for materials that could not arrive. Gaton's generals, the same ones who had cheered his bold speeches at the summit, now whispered about replacing him. A warlord who could not supply his own army was no warlord at all. The Oshari Collective had made its choice. Delegate Pren, after weeks of unanswered calls, had broken from the Concord entirely. He sent a private message to Earth, not through official channels, but through an old trade frequency that Yoon Hana had once given him as a gesture of friendship. The message was simple. It was an apology and a request to restore their trade partnership. Humanity accepted. Within hours, the Oshari corridors were reactivated. Stabilization arrays powered up. Ships began moving again. The Oshari economy, which had been bleeding out slowly, gasped and started to breathe. The rest of the galaxy watched this happen in real time, and the message was impossible to miss. Humanity was not gone. They were not hiding. They were choosing. They decided who got access and who did not. And right now, the Concord did not. Grand Arbiter Velon spent those 2 cycles in a state he had never experienced before. Uncertainty. He held emergency councils that led nowhere. He made speeches that no one believed. He sent formal requests to the human government that were politely acknowledged and never answered. The Concord, the great institution he had led for centuries, was cracking at its foundation, and he could not stop it. Finally, through a chain of back-channel communications that passed through 4 neutral species, Velon managed to arrange a private meeting with Kim Tae-ho. No delegations, no media, no public record. Just 2 leaders on a neutral ship in deep space. Tae-ho agreed. But when Velon arrived at the meeting point, a small, unarmed diplomatic vessel, floating in the empty space between 2 dead star systems, he found that Tae-ho had not come alone. Yoon Hana and Lee Nari stood beside him. Velon looked at the 3 humans and then back at Tae-ho. "I requested a private meeting," he said. Tae-ho met his gaze without blinking. "I bring my people everywhere," he said. "That is something you should have learned about us by now." Velon said nothing to that. He sat down at the small table in the center of the ship's meeting room. The room was plain. Metal walls, simple chairs, no decorations, no symbols of power. Just a table and the people around it. For a moment, neither side spoke. Velon looked older than he had at the summit. His gray stone skin had new cracks running along the edges of his face, a sign of stress in the Mithari species. His hands, usually still and steady, rested on the table with a slight tremor. "What will it take," Velon said slowly, "for humanity to return to the Concord?" He leaned back in his chair and looked at the Grand Arbiter with an expression that was neither angry nor cold. It was patient. The kind of patience that came not from waiting, but from already knowing. "Why should we?" Tae-ho said. The question hung in the air. Velon opened his mouth and then closed it. He had prepared arguments. He had prepared appeals to duty, to legacy, to the greater good. But the question cut through all of it like a blade. Why should they? Humanity had offered its work, its technology, its knowledge. They had shared freely. They had asked only to keep what they had built, and the galaxy had voted to take it from them. Not because humanity had done anything wrong, but because humanity had done too much right, and others wanted what they had. Why should they come back? Velon looked down at his hands. The trembling was worse now. He was not used to feeling powerless, and the feeling was ugly and unfamiliar. "Because we need you," he said, and for the first time, his voice did not carry the weight of authority. It carried the weight of truth. Tae-ho studied him for a long moment. Then he looked at Hana. Hana placed a data tablet on the table and slid it across to Velon. "These are our terms," she said. Her voice was the same as it had always been, calm, clear, and precise. "This is not a negotiation. This is a restructuring proposal. You may accept it or decline it." Velon read the terms. There were 4. First, all infrastructure discovered, built, and maintained by humanity would remain under human sovereignty permanently. No future vote, no motion, no consensus could change this. What humans built belonged to humans. Second, any future vote regarding the redistribution of any species' resources or infrastructure would require the unanimous consent of the affected species. Majority rule would no longer be enough to take what belonged to others. Third, the Galactic Concord would formally recognize humanity's contributions to galactic infrastructure in the permanent record. Every communication relay, every corridor, every purification system, every piece of technology that humanity had shared would be acknowledged openly. Fourth, Warlord Gatton would be formally censured for orchestrating a predatory resource seizure under the cover of collective governance. Velen read the first three terms and accepted them in his mind without difficulty. They were fair. They were, if he was honest with himself, what should have been guaranteed from the beginning. But the fourth term made him stop. Censuring Gatton meant admitting that the Concord had been manipulated. It meant saying publicly that the vote was not about fairness, but about greed. It meant telling the galaxy that the Grand Arbiter himself had allowed it to happen. This last point, Velen said carefully, it would damage the Concord's reputation. Lee Nari, who had been silent until now, reached into her jacket and placed a data chip on the table. She slid it toward Velen with 2 fingers. That chip contains every intercepted communication between Gatton and his allies, she said. Her voice was soft and even, the voice of someone who dealt in facts and did not care about feelings. Every backroom deal, every promise he made to carve up our corridors, every lie he told to build his voting block. She paused and looked at Velen directly. You can censure him for his actions, or we can release this to every network in the galaxy and let the public censure you both. The room was very quiet. Velen looked at the data chip. He looked at Nari's calm, steady eyes. He looked at Hana, who watched him without expression. And he looked at Tejo, who had not moved, who had not raised his voice, who sat in his chair with the same quiet certainty he had carried since the first day of the summit. Velon picked up the data tablet and signed the terms. 1 galactic cycle later, the human delegation returned to Horizon Accord. The Grand Chamber was full again, but the atmosphere was nothing like the summit. There were no loud conversations, no confident murmurs, no sharp-toothed smiles from the Rule section. The chamber was quiet. Not the dead silence of shock, like the day the humans had left, but something more permanent. Something that had settled into the bones of every species present. The 5 humans entered through the same doors they had walked out of. Tejo at the front, Hana to his right, Nari, Dohan, and Sunwoo behind them. They wore the same simple clothes. They carried the same few items. Nothing about them had changed. They walked to their 5 chairs. They sat down. That was all. No speech, no celebration, no display of victory. They sat down the way people sit down when they return to a place they never truly left, with the ease of those who had always known they would be back, and had simply been waiting for the rest of the room to understand why. Observer Lien watched from her seat in the back rows. Her chronicle device was open, and her silver fingers hovered above it, ready. She had spent 2 cycles writing about the crisis, about the panic and the hunger and the political collapse. She had recorded Gatton's censure, a humiliating public proceeding that had stripped the warlord of his seat and left the Rule Dominion scrambling for new leadership. She had documented the Oshari's return to human trade and the desperate letters from dozens of species begging for corridor access. But this moment, the moment 5 humans sat down in 5 chairs, was the one she knew she would remember longest. She began to write. The humans returned today. They did not celebrate. They did not gloat. They did not remind us of what we had done or what it had cost. They simply sat down as if they had never left. And somehow, that was the most terrifying thing of all. She paused. Her fingers trembled slightly, a rare thing for a Tessic. I have chronicled 10,000 species across 400 cycles. I have seen empires rise with fleets of millions. I have seen worlds burn and civilizations vanish into silence. But I have never seen a room of galactic leaders fall silent because 5 beings sat down in chairs. She looked down at the 5 humans one more time. Teho had folded his hands in his lap. Hana was reviewing something on her tablet. Nari's eyes moved across the room in their usual quiet sweep. Dohan sat like stone. Sunwoo gave a polite nod to a nearby delegation. They looked so ordinary, so small. 5 people in a room of thousands. Lien finished her entry. Perhaps that is the lesson the galaxy learned today. Humanity does not conquer with ships or weapons. They do not shout or threaten or make grand displays of power. They build, they share, and when they are wronged, they take their work and leave, and they let the silence teach the lesson that words never could. They conquer by being the ones you cannot afford to lose, and now, sitting quietly in their chairs, they have reminded every species in this chamber of a truth that most of us were too proud to see. She saved the entry and closed her device. You do not take from the ones who give you everything, because the day they stop giving, you will learn exactly how much you had, and how little you deserved it. The grand chamber hummed with quiet conversation. The lights floated above like small stars. And in the center of it all, 5 humans sat in 5 chairs and said nothing at all.